I would like to, as Chris and I have talked about this many times, and I had a conversation with one of our co-chairs, and he used words like, or phrases like climbing Mount Everest and Olympian-type efforts and things like that, and how this all could be done. And those things may all be true, how difficult it's going to be. What I always try to do is put these things in a long-term historical reference. In 1776, we had the Founding Fathers, our best minds in the room, and they decided that the Declaration of Independence had to be unanimous. All 13 states had to agree. Well, there was a problem. In some of the states, slavery was legal. And John Adams, on behalf of his state, stood up and said, we have to deal with this now, or it's going to tear our nation apart. Some of the states said, we're not signing if that happens. So they didn't deal with it. 13 years later, in Philadelphia, they adopted the Constitution. They had the same discussion. We have to deal with this. And they didn't. They said, well, eventually, and it was the thought at the time, eventually the institution would just die out. So in 1820, the issue came up because Missouri was going to become a state. What are we going to do with Missouri? And the great senator from Kentucky, Henry Clay, came up with the Missouri Compromise. And slavery to the south of the line and no slavery to the north. And it was hailed as a great effort. It's going to keep our country together. We'll keep moving forward. We'll be united. But they put the issue off. And we dealt with that through the years. Andrew Jackson, one of our great presidents, dealt with the nullification crisis. And it was largely about federal government and states' rights, but it also dealt with the slavery issue. And when Texas came into the Union, and John Tyler dealt with that issue, and then James K. Polk, and a war didn't start over slavery necessarily, but that happened. All of those issues continued to be pushed off. And they dealt with the same thing in 1854 in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It put it off a little bit further. The people at the time didn't have to deal with it. Someone else can deal with this in the future. But for now, everybody's all happy we're compromising on this. And in 1861, the worst tragedy that's ever happened in our country occurred. 600,000 Americans died, and towns all over the South were burned to the ground. Our nation was destroyed, and certainly in a great cause, as Abraham Lincoln's speech would say at Gettysburg. But the real reason that war happened is because folks sitting in the room, elected leaders like all of us, even the great ones, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, all of those folks through the years, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, they failed to deal with the issue. Because at the time, what they had to get done, they couldn't deal with this terrible institution that was in place. And that's what we have to consider. Are we going to be the people who deal with the issues right now at the federal government level, or are we going to put that off until a real crisis occurs? So that's my speech for why we're here. A couple of doubters who I got to come to this, I gave that speech and they went, oh, okay, now I understand what you're talking about. And so thanks for the time.
State Representative Raymond Dean from the state of Minnesota. And just a few comments. Thank you for your opening remarks. Not a constitutional scholar. I'm sure there are a few in the room. So I'm going to say a few things that folks may not agree with, and I think we all understand that we're all not going to agree on everything as we go through the next few days. You know, the Federalist Papers are not our governing documents of our country. They were actually the framework from which our forefathers wrote our Constitution. And I think we need to be really cautious on how we reference the Federalist Papers. They were guiding documents ultimately. We can look for them for guidance, but I think we need to be really clear that they're not our governmental documents. So that's my personal point of view. You may have a different personal point of view on that. I also think when we talk about the power that we have as states, I think if we frame it as, it's not really just the power that we have, it's our responsibility. And I think that that's really important to understand, that we have a responsibility as states if the federal government isn't acting in a way which we believe is beneficial for the people of our country. It's not just the power that we have, it's the responsibility. So just sort of putting the frame around that. And just one correction, more than 27 times Congress has proposed amendments. It's only passed ratification 27 times. So there are a few other amendments that have been proposed to states that haven't been ratified. And certainly that's, when we get through here, that might be the possibility. And ultimately, I think, I'm excited to be here because it really is about setting up the process and how this would happen. So I want to thank you.
Yeah, you betcha.
Thank you.
Mulmunion from Virginia. I guess a question for Chris or any member of the executive committee, particularly on the point of the rules continuing into a meeting of the convention to consider proposing an amendment under Article 5. So I think you've got an intriguing idea. The convention meets, the rules are in place, but there's no Article 5 call from Congress. There's no amendment under consideration. That's all in place. And then 34 states, we get to that total, the convention's called. My concern is that some at that time might assert, well, this is really something different. Glad that you guys did all that work prior, but this is not just a continuation of the thing you did before. And so a new set of rules and concerns about runaway conventions would arise. Is there any legal scholarship that you've consulted at this point, or should maybe one of the committees be in consultation with legal scholars going forward on that point, so we would have some confidence that we could make this process stick?
Yeah, well, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and I'm not an attorney. And we wrestled with what you were talking about. This process took about 8 months to kind of define and figure out, because what we did is we kept looking for bulletproof ways to say there is no way around this unless you're actually breaking the law. So as far as the continuation clause, and if it carries into the next body, that next body, if they do come into place, I mean, there's no legal argument against this being a legislative body. And I have presented this to some constitutional scholars. I haven't had anybody come back and say, you're wrong right here, that actually can't happen because of this. We have not hit any roadblocks on this method yet. And I'm not saying we know everything, but we also have to remember, and this is something I learned a lot, again, Article 5 on its own is very clear that this is a state process that is to be defined. So we have to be careful with how much we allow outside influences to guide us, which is kind of, success comes from many advisors, but in this situation, we just need to be a little careful. Yeah, Senator Long. And any other members, if you have